We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Linsey McGoey. She is a senior lecturer of sociology at the University of Essex and author of No Such Thing as a Free Gift, the Gates Foundation, and the Price of Philanthropy. Welcome to the program, Linsey.
Thank you.
So let's start with this term philanthrocapitalism. What is philanthrocapitalism?
Sure. It's not my term. It was coined by a journalist named Matthew Bishop, who's works at The Economist magazine. And in 2008, he expanded on the term in a book that was co-authored with a development specialist named Michael Green that was called Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. This book, published in 2008, essentially defines philanthrocapitalism in two main ways. It's firstly the idea that philanthropists are increasingly applying techniques honed from business to philanthropic giving in order to make charity essentially more business-like, more results-oriented, more cost-effective. And then secondly, it's the idea that capitalism is itself a naturally philanthropic process by improving living standards everywhere according to their definition, and therefore philanthropists should embrace capitalism's naturally wealth-producing propensities by applying the profit motive to philanthropic giving and potentially giving more grants to for-profit entities, doing whatever possible to apply the profit motive to charitable giving.
It's that second part that is really sort of, I think, going to open some eyes for some people. I mean, the idea of making charity more effective or more targeted, or so that people, when they give, just broadly speaking, have a sense of the efficacy of what their charitable giving is doing is, I think, is rather uncontroversial. It's the second part, which is sort of stunning, and we will get to that part in a moment. But let's go back, as you do in your book, and sort of track some of these, at least in this country, early sort of models for what we see today. And correct me if I'm wrong in characterizing people like Carnegie and Rockefeller as sort of early models of this philanthrocapital in some way, capitalism.
They are. You could sort of see them as proto-philanthrocapitalists. One point I make in the book is that there's a far longer longevity to the idea that philanthropists should apply business-like tactics to giving than some proponents of philanthrocapitalism today seem to realize. So you have this almost sense of hubris surrounding the new philanthropy, that it is unprecedentedly interested in being more strategic and results-oriented. But that was Carnegie and Rockefeller's main aim. They were quite explicit that they wanted to model their philanthropies on corporate structures in order to bring more efficiency to giving. Well, whether or not they achieved that's an ongoing question. And a point my book makes is that they faced a lot of public doubt and skepticism for their philanthropic giving in a way that philanthropists today don't necessarily receive.
Well, give us some examples of that in the context of, let's say, Rockefeller, because and also sort of like, what, I mean, it starts sort of, it's even beyond, I mean, we have some sort of assumptions there, right, in terms of what their strategic goals are about their philanthropy that we presume. I mean, it's one thing to say, like, we're going to use business practices here to effectively do good, but how we define do good is also sort of, I think, up for grabs, right?
Very much so, very much so. I think in the early 20th century, there was a strong need and a recognition that a lot of good might be achieved through applying philanthropic dollars to, say, new developments in medicine. And that's something that Rockefeller did in an important way, in a sense. So his grandson died from scarlet fever, and he was interested in seeing if some of these new institutes that were set up in Europe, like the Pasteur Institute, whether or not they could develop a more biomedical model in the States. And he applied his giving to that aim. And that, in a way, is highly laudable. At the same time, he and Carnegie were fiercely committed to the idea that they themselves knew how to meet the needs of the poor in a way that, in essence, their workers did not know. So they resisted efforts to develop unions at their corporations. They were strongly wedded to militaristically suppressing labor efforts. And so there was widespread concern that philanthropy, in a way, was used to alleviate their workers' concerns in a way that their workers did not themselves want. Their workers wanted, in essence, justice and better bargaining rights and more regulatory protections, and not charity given on a whim.
And I mean, and it goes beyond that too, because one is a structural change, it seems to me, and the other is less so, right? I mean, if you strengthen mechanisms in which to empower labor, that has some durability theoretically, as opposed to well, we're going to provide sort of some stopgap measures that may quell any urge to make any structural changes.
Well, that certainly was the view of both socialist supporters as well as simply people who wanted better regulatory mechanisms at the turn of the 20th century. So Oscar Wilde, for example, the Irish playwright and author, made comments that were very similar to what you've just said in a very influential essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he said, in essence, why should the poor be grateful for crumbs that fall from a rich man's table? They should be seated at the board and are beginning to know it. So there was this idea that there should be much more of a willingness to alter structural inequalities that was a demand being put forward by literally the working poor, those who took home a wage, but it wasn't enough to cover their sustenance needs. They were demanding a fairer economic system rather than simply charity doled out on a whim.
Is there any way for us to know just like sort of how much when a Rockefeller, let's say, or a Carnegie gave money, how much of that was a function of I want to find a cure for this disease, and how much of it was also I am the guy to find, who has the ability, how much of it was ego, and then how much of it was in this giving, I also want to head off some things that the benefits are going to come back to me and my enterprises in sort of bank shot sideways.
I think it's a mix of all those three things. I think particularly in Carnegie's case, he was very explicit about his aims, his motivations for giving, and he very much upheld that second point you mentioned, which is that he did see himself as better placed, as he put it in a very influential essay, The Gospel of Wealth, which was published in 1889, first under the title Wealth, but then in the UK some people responded a little bit sardonically and called it, this is Carnegie's new gospel. And he quite liked the quip, and he then appropriated it, and later editions were always published with the full title of Gospel of Wealth. But in essence, Carnegie says in that essay that the rich are better placed than a community to oversee and to meet their needs. So there was a strong sense of exceptionality amongst those who had amassed great wealth, as well as their paternalistic duty and right to steward that wealth in a way that they were better placed to understand than any community. And I think there was a lot of resistance against that sense of paternalism at the turn of the 20th century. There was a feeling that it was not in line with principles of a democratic nation, which essentially uphold the equality of all individuals to try to meet their own needs, and that philanthropy was in some way cause dependency, but also through philanthropy, they were using their wealth and the giving away of their wealth as a bulwark against redistributive demands.
How strong was that sentiment that, not the latter part in terms of like seeing what the the giving did in terms of the sort of the social mechanisms. But that notion of paternalism, I mean, that obviously, Carnegie felt like I'm rich, and so I necessarily have better ideas, or the same things that made me rich have given me the powers also to have insight into social problems. I mean, I ask that in the context of, sort of, which is in many ways unrelated to your book, but just when I watch Donald Trump surge in the Republican polls and note that it seems to be sort of untethered from any policy prescriptions, and putting aside to the how much I think he is appreciated by some on the right for truth telling, as they would call it. But part of that also has to be like the guy's a billionaire, and he is credited, particularly by folks, I think, of that demographic, with certain sort of, I guess, beyond mere mortal powers, because those powers are what allowed him to accrue that kind of money.
Mm-hmm. I think we're seeing a lot of this sort of almost canonization of the wealthy in a way that we perhaps didn't have in the mid-20th century, and perhaps we had at the turn of the 20th century in the way that we're seeing a resuscitation of today. And I think the problem with that assumption of sort of exceptional heroicism or almost saintly behavior is that it's divorced from any contextual appreciation of the way that wealth is generated. So certainly both Trump and, for example, a lot of wealthy philanthropists today had certain circumstances which helped to generate their wealth in the first place. Trump did get quite a bit of help from his family. In the case of some of the tech entrepreneurs, there's also a lot of governmental help towards their wealth creation in the form of things like patent protections, in the form of direct subsidies, when in the case of Elon Musk and Tesla. So this heroicism and assumption of exceptionality is taking place in a context that doesn't pay sufficient attention to governmental support that's often instrumental in that wealth creation.
And I'd also add just, luck. I mean, right? I mean, it's...
I
there's...
think too much is put down to luck there. And I think in that way that the luck narrative feeds the heroicism and the exceptionality narrative in a strange way.
Oh, we'll talk about that, because I mean, I think, I guess I perceive the luck as like everybody gets these benefits. It's just also, there was probably 3 other guys who were getting the benefits that, any one individual breaks through, but they're all still getting those benefits. The development of the internet, whatever it is.
Yeah. No, very good point.
Well, all right. So let's come up to the Gates Foundation, because they are Bill and Melinda Gates. Is the size of their wealth unprecedented? Is the size of their foundation unprecedented, or do we actually just hear more about them relative to the size of what they give?
When it comes to sheer dollar amounts, the size of the foundation does dwarf the size of earlier large foundations like the Carnegie, which it was called the Carnegie Corporation, but it functioned like a foundation, or the Ford Foundation, or the Rockefeller Foundation. So when Warren Buffett gave a gift of $30 billion worth of shares in Berkshire Hathaway to the Gates Foundation in 2006, an act that essentially doubled the size of the Gates Foundation overnight, a philanthropy expert named Joel Fleshman points out that gift of $30 billion worth of shares was more than Carnegie and Rockefeller gave away over their lifetimes combined when adjusted for 2006 dollars.
Wow.
But then proportionate to the size of the overall U.S. economy, the Gates Foundation is actually a lot smaller than some of its predecessors. So the Ford Foundation in 1960, as a proportionate share of the GDP, was larger in proportionate terms than the Gates Foundation is today. So giving is actually increasing when it comes to dollar amounts, but as a proportion of the GDP, overall U.S. giving, foundations and individuals combined, has stayed stable at about 2% of the GDP since 1970.
This is the sheer dollar amount, even adjusted for inflation, is much larger, but the impact, right, relative to the impact of the government, is that what when we talk about GDP? I mean, is the sort of
exactly.
the real?
Exactly.
Okay, that's fascinating. And so, all right. Well, so why focus on the Gates Foundation? Simply because of that fact that there is no single player out there that has the impact on, let's say, what's going on in the States or the world, for that matter, I guess, in this day and age.
When it comes to the ability to leverage their donations to exert influence over public policy, there's a growing consensus that no other philanthropic organization is as powerful or as influential as the Gates Foundation. One of the reasons why I focus on the foundation is that in many ways I think their efforts are very well-intentioned and well-meaning. I don't think that they themselves are trying to conduct philanthropy for personal gain. But I also think that they ideologically have been shown through a number of their grants to be very sanguine and positive about the idea that private wealth creation will inevitably reap public demands. And they're stewarding their wealth in a manner that's essentially increasing the role of the private sector at times in instances where private gain might not be warranted or useful and might actually thwart a narrowing of inequality rather than help to improve inequality levels. So I think though they are well-intentioned, a lot of their grant giving is very much exacerbating existent inequalities.
And I mean, I can just hear the critics there, saying, well, if you know so much, how come you're not a billionaire? I mean, that's right. I mean, that is the sort of I guess the encapsulation of the notion that the Gates that billionaires could do no wrong. But let's talk specifically. I mean, we've had many people on this program to talk about the implications of the Gates' influence on education. But talk to us about that, and in particular, I mean, I'm fascinated. In fact, let's go directly to that before we go to education and health is broken out in terms of the implications. What I was really struck by was the amount of giving and just the notion of that the Gates Foundation gives money as a donation to private corporations that we all recognize that are ostensibly charity gifts that seem to be just investments that that these companies don't have to give money back on. Okay, can you explain this to us? Because I'm still sort of trying to get my head wrapped around this.
This is something that the philanthropy community, a network of scholars, nonprofit executives, activists, that community is struggling to comprehend itself because in some ways it's not a new phenomenon and in some ways it is. So in the past you've often had philanthropic foundations offering grants to certain industry-intensive sectors like the pharmaceutical sector, which claims that it needs extra support towards research and development in order to invest in treatments where there's simply not a large market drive for therapies because sufferers can't afford to pay for payments. So treatments that disproportionately affect the world's poor. So you've had a long-standing history in the UK, for example, where the Wellcome Trust, which is a very large philanthropic organization, about half the size of the Gates Foundation, it often gives some grants to pharmaceutical companies, and there's strict requirements on essentially the ability to commercialize upon those grants. What we're seeing now is a novel trend towards extending such grants to entities outside the pharma sector in ways that I think are quite surprising. So, for example, MasterCard, not the foundation, but the corporation, received a $10 million grant from the Gates Foundation to set up the Lab for Financial Inclusion in Nairobi, Kenya. And this was very proudly sort of trumpeted and championed by MasterCard itself. And the company said, well, we recognize as a company that we're all in this together, so we're happy to accept this grant in order to set up a lab which may well lead to financial innovations, which I'm paraphrasing here, but they essentially say, which should be profitable for us, but because we don't have enough certainty that they will be profitable, we need a philanthropic handout to get the investment going.
So just to be clear,
this is a novel trend.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of amazing. It is a R&D grant, essentially, to MasterCard to come up with new, innovative ways of getting, I guess, underdeveloped countries into, financialize them in some way so that they can start to collect fees. Like, what are we going to do? There's no ATMs around, or we don't have enough people who are picking up, who will pay with MasterCard. We're going to develop a whole new thing where they can, I don't know, they'll have their own little MasterCard reader, and be able to do it anywhere in the world. And of course, we'll get our 2 or 3% fees. It is.
Yeah. And I have no concern if that's done in a sort of VC venture capital way, in essence, where essentially a loan can be made to the company, but at some stage the company is on the hook to repay the loan, or an equity stake where potentially the foundation receives an ongoing return for the investment. So the Gates Foundation does do these things as well. They engage in program-related investments and endowment investments, and I think whatever you make of those type of loans or investments, they are, I think, defensible and have a long-standing history. What's novel are these non-repayable grants. Other recipients include Scholastic in the United States, which recently sold its digital education arm at a profit to another company. So you're seeing this way that philanthropic entities, although by law they're meant to only give to a for-profit if it's used solely for charitable means, they're investing and offering grants to for-profits in ways that I think definitely breach that requirement to solely use a gift for charitable objectives. They're quite explicitly being used in a highly commercial way by recipients such as MasterCard, which time and again point out that new investments are risky, so we can't do it ourselves. We need help. Well, that just completely compromises the whole ethos, supposedly, of free market capitalism, which is that risk takers should reap rewards. Well, businesses increasingly are not the risk takers.
Well, all right. Now, let's break down what, aside from sort of the, sort of lifting the veil on that risk takers get rewards thing. I mean, we definitely have corporations all the time, sort of externalizing that risk taking to, let's say, the government, right? I mean, we have the government developing certain drugs, we have the government developing certain technologies, we have the government developing the internet, we have all of this, and the corporations will build on those developments, and then they'll go and make a ton of money. We regardless of whether people want to believe it or not, the government is always picking winners and losers, even if they don't know who the winners are going to be and who the losers are going to be. They're providing stuff to people who are well situated to exploit this stuff, and I think we have a less than clear understanding of that. What is problematic with a nonprofit or a charity, let's say, doing this type of work? I mean, aside from the fact that it's just super creepy in a way, because we don't perceive a charitable foundation as sort of providing the seed money for businesses that they just happen to think, it will help people. I mean, why not provide seed business for Uber? I mean, it's so convenient. What is like sort of, I guess, sort of very tangentially problematic about it?
I think that's a great question. Certainly, what my book points out is that this is simply an extension of public subsidies towards the private sector that have been ongoing for centuries, which have been instrumental to the rise of the American economy, for example. What's new is that the rate at which grants by foundations to for-profits seem to be increasing, and it's very unclear just how many grants are being offered, because I only looked at the Gates Foundation. So to what extent are the Koch brothers, for example, contributing to for-profit entities is still an open-ended question that nobody has sufficiently investigated. There's been a lot of studies done on the Koch brothers' investments, but whether or not they are giving directly to for-profits at the same scale as, say, the Gates Foundation is not clear. What's important, I think, is to look at charity law in the United States, which is explicitly predicated on the belief that private wealth generation, private profiteering from charitable grants contravenes IRS regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So in the United States, for example, in the state of New York, you had your Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, I believe, and he found the Pearson Foundation essentially had breached the law because it was using grants from another foundation in order to generate revenue from the parent corporation for Pearson, and therefore he fined the foundation. But what I point out is that if the grants had been given directly to the corporation by another foundation, like, say, the Gates Foundation, that seemingly wouldn't have breached the law. So I think currently our laws are insufficient, or I should say your laws, because I'm a Canadian living in Britain, but I focus on the U.S., and U.S. policy has a very strong influence on other nations. Your laws currently are not clear for just at what stage it is permissible for a for-profit entity to profiteer from a charitable grant that represents a loss to the taxpayer, because obviously taxpayers are on the hook. They're paying money that is essentially retained by private philanthropists when they receive a tax deduction for large-scale giving.
So in other words, we could have a situation, just to put this more explicitly, where there is the Koch Foundation, and they say, we're going to give a $300 million grant to Koch Industries to figure out how to make the byproduct of some petroleum product safer for the environment.
Illegal. No, that would be deemed illegal, because you cannot be seen as offering grants that directly inure to the private benefit of a benefactor corporation. But it would potentially be legal for the Koch Foundation, I don't even know if that exists in those terms, but for a foundation that's at an arm's length from a corporation to give to an entirely different corporation and still be within the law. But they cannot give to an entity that is directly related to them.
All right, so we could do it this way. I have the Seder Foundation. I'm going to give money to McGoey Corp. To develop this product that I think is going to be very good for people, broadly speaking. And then the McGoey Foundation just happens to believe that they should give to the Seder Corp., which is also engaged in developing something that's going to be very helpful for people. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to game this, right? And it's not uncommon that these are, you and I sit in the whatever it is, the club, and we're having some scotch, and we just say, hey, I like what your company is doing. I like what your company's doing. I think I might be able to throw money your way. I mean,
I'll rub your back, and you give me some money to set up a lab for financial inclusion.
And that's amazing. And there's no, I mean, you're right. There's no scrutiny of this.
There's been, I think, a non-awareness. There's been a general lack of understanding at the rate at which grants to for-profits seems to be increasing. And I think there's been a long-standing assumption amongst philanthropy scholars that actually you need to give directly to what are called 501c3 organizations, which are nonprofit entities, in order to meet IRS stipulations. But actually that's not the case. So there is this legal ability to give to for-profits, but it's been done so rarely in the past that we haven't had an understanding of the consequences for when it happens. And I think right now what you're seeing is management scholars are way ahead of this when it comes to an understanding of the field, and they are championing the practice with great acclaim and excitement. So you had an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review this year or last year, which talked about the need to get charity to the companies that need it the most. So forget about giving charities to nonprofits. We need to amplify the giving to needy companies. And I think this is an incredible perversion of charitable law and charitable regulations, which tried to set up firewalls between giving and profiteering.
I just don't understand how a company can legally take this money. I mean, let me get a little self-centered here. How can I go to a foundation and say, my small company here that does this podcast, I want to innovate a new product that I think is really going to be helpful to people.
There are limits on giving directly to private individuals. So it's something that's seen as the private inurement rule, which is essentially an effort to prohibit private profiteering. But at the institution level, at the corporation level, the same prohibition, it certainly hasn't applied in the case of the MasterCard donation. It hasn't applied in the case of Vodacom, which is an offshoot of Vodafone, which is a major British telecoms provider. They received over $6 million from the Gates Foundation to expand mobile banking in regions of Africa. And mobile banking is a helpful service, but what I don't understand is why Vodacom can't foot its own bills for something that's been so incredibly profitable for it, why it needs charity from the Gates Foundation to expand on a venture which is clearly commercial in intent.
That to me is stunning, and I should just say that this podcast is we're incorporated. I mean, so if there's anybody out there who thinks that it's going to be of great social benefit for me to have a more accessible app, let's say, we can talk about this because we'll set up a whole division, an R&D division to look at this. All right. Well, very, very briefly, because I appreciate the time you're giving us, because I'm just blown away by the implications of this. And like you say, it is completely opaque. So we just happen to know this about the Gates Foundation. It's a very high-profile foundation. But theoretically, there could be tons of these foundations out there pouring money into corporations in ways that we just don't even imagine. Just give us a sense of, like, just in the context of health policy, broadly speaking, because I think, we've talked about education policy in this country and how the implications of everything that the Gates Foundation has done in terms of Common Core and high stakes testing and this notion of constant tracking and assessment and what it does to the incentives of teachers. Tell us how can it be bad if the Gates Foundation's giving money to World Health?
I think in the health sphere, it's a case where there's been a lot of clear-cut gains. And I think that unlike the education sphere, where essentially, as Mr. Gates himself indicated in a New York Times interview recently, his grants haven't moved the dial at all when it comes to seeing improvement in student outcomes. In global health, it's clear that actually the Gates Foundation's entry onto the scene has simply revitalized governmental attention, governmental expectations, or obligations when it comes to their own giving. So I think there's been a lot of gains. But at the same time, the Gates Foundation grants disproportionately do not answer or respond to global burden of disease. So he pours money into polio, which a lot of health activists feel is not a good use of funds, because actually polio cases are quite rare, and there is a cost-effective case for eradicating it completely, but that case is also heavily disputed by people who say that this is thwarting priorities. It's actually making health delivery harder on the ground because you're stripping money away from other needed interventions. The other concern is that the Gates Foundation does not give much of its investments at all towards non-communicable chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, and obesity, which increasingly account for a greater proportion of the global burden of disease than communicable diseases like, say, malaria or tuberculosis. And this is actually representing its contributions to the World Health Organization, for example, and its insistence that infectious diseases should be prioritized over these chronic diseases is leading to essentially a distortion of global health funding.
And so, in other words, once there's money there, it attracts sort of other money and other resources in terms of, let's say, researchers, right? Like I'm no longer gonna work on cancer because there's a lot of money in completely eradicating the last remnants of polio.
Yeah, that's one concern, is that funding priorities tend to dictate research choices. That's a long-standing problem, but it's simply the question of who gets to decide. And the concern is that why should an individual, by virtue of the wealth that's been amassed, be allowed to carry out essentially almost governmental functions when that individual hasn't been appointed or elected in any capacity? So it's this idea of where's the accountability? And we need more transparency over just how influential the foundation has been in dictating WHO policy, for example, because the WHO is getting a lot of flack for being incapacitated, for not having sufficient resources for combating sort of epidemic situations. But the WHO's funding has itself been constrained and has itself been affected by having to answer to voluntary contributions and voluntary demands stipulated by private donors. So its own incapacity is not simply a problem of its own making. It's possibly been compounded by the increased role played by private donors.
Do these private donors, I mean, presumably, right? Like Bill Gates, if I was the Bill Gates Foundation, I would think like, I'm going to go out there and hire the world's greatest health policy person, and they're going to tell me what are the primary sort of health challenges around the world, and that's where I'm going to give my money. Does it work like that, or is it like, what's going to be the thing that when I die, I'm going to die knowing that like polio was completely eradicated because of the Gateses? I mean, is there a certain amount of like some areas are sexier and some are going to, where it's going to be clear you can go in and make your mark? Like everybody's going to say this disease does not exist anymore because of that person, or is it, or how does it happen that that their, I guess, agenda would be misaligned?
I think certainly in the case of non-communicable diseases, this certainly hasn't been a short-sighted failing simply of the Gates Foundation. The entire global health community has been taken by surprise by just how quickly deaths, early premature deaths from chronic diseases, have outpaced deaths from communicable diseases in developing regions. So does an element of hubris enter into decision-making? Possibly. I mean, I don't want to impute motivation. I do genuinely think that the Gateses are quite well-intentioned and they want to achieve a lot of good. But the idea that one foundation that doesn't have a board of directors, which is a big complaint of philanthropy experts who think there should be more of a formal decision-making process in place at the Gates Foundation, the idea that an organization that is only responsive really to its three trustees, Bill, Melinda, and Warren Buffett, the idea that such an organization can have such a powerful influence on a UN organization such as the WHO set up following World War II, it's an alarming development, and one that I suggest simply needs more attention, because as well-intentioned as the Gates Foundation is, they themselves are not omniscient, and they themselves might be blinkered by certain ideological predilections, such as, for example, faith in current patent policies, which a lot of health activists see as counterproductive for health needs.
Linsey McGoey, the book is No Such Thing as a Free Gift, the Gates Foundation and the Price of Philanthropy. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.